Elizabeth Warren was on all the Sunday talk shows this weekend talking about the very disappointing Democratic support for the bank bill. And Warren has been very good about specifically calling out not just Democrats broadly speaking and not just criticizing the bill, but calling out specific Democrats, which, that doesn't happen very often. You don't even hear Bernie talk about specific Democrats. This is someone who is not terribly concerned about alienating certain parts of the Democratic Senate, because this is that ugly, this bill. And we spoke about it with David Dayen, I guess it was last week. And just to recap, we're talking about a bill that started out as providing relief for community banks, even though the vast majority of community banks, somewhere around 92% of community banks around the country are doing quite well. There is a lot of political salience, let's say, to a politician to have helped a local bank. And by relieving them of certain regulations, we are no way endangering the financial system, because they are not a big part of the system, or they are not so large that if they go under, they will jeopardize the system. However, what the Republicans have done, with the help of a dozen Democrats, is they have expanded the definition of what a community bank is. So instead of it being a small bank that does $50 million worth of business, let's say, it's now a bank that does a small bank that does $50 billion worth of business or has assets, to one to where it's $250 billion, to so-called stadium banks. These are more like regional banks that have the ability to name a stadium after themselves. And these banks can threaten the stability of the system. Not to mention, it also opens up the definitions of things like custodial banks to banks that do some custodial services, but they're not actually custodial banks. So here is Elizabeth Warren on this very question.
And another big issue we're going to be talking about this week is this bill that you are very interested in. The Senate voted, as you know, to advance a new banking bill that would ease regulations on banks with assets that are less than $250 billion, with the support of 16 Senate Democrats. You've been calling out members of your party who voted in favor of this bill, many of whom are facing difficult reelection bids in states that President Trump won. Do you think that voters should hold any Democrat who votes for this plan accountable at the polls? Would they be responsible if another financial crisis were to occur?
Well, look, let's talk about what the bill does. And what this bill says, here it is, on the 10th anniversary of the biggest crash since the Great Depression, this Senate is now advancing a bill that would celebrate that anniversary by saying that 25 of the 40 largest banks in America, these 25 banks together sucked down more than $50 billion in taxpayer bailouts. Why? Because the economy needed them to stay up and running. Nobody went to jail. And this bill says, let's let those 25 banks be regulated just, like they were tiny little community banks. I got to tell you, $250 billion bank is not a community bank. So what's the consequence of doing that, plus other changes that help the remaining banks? The answer is it puts us at greater risk that that there will be another taxpayer bailout, that there will be another crash and another taxpayer bailout.
Yeah.
And you don't have to take my word for it. This is what the Congressional Budget Office
Democrats
says.
going along with this? Are you disappointed that your colleagues are going to be voting in favor of this legislation? After all, you said that these sorts of loose sort of rules on Wall Street helped cause the financial crisis in 2007, 2008.
And that's true. It did help cause the crisis. Frankly, I just don't see how any senator can vote to weaken the regulations on Wall Street banks.
Yep. Well, and now, Matt, I'm sitting here, all comfortable in Brooklyn, but you're from the heartland, right? You're from North Dakota, is that correct?
That's correct.
And so give me a sense, when you talk to the folks back home, which I presume is done through the Pony
Tin
Express.
can and some wire.
Pony Express, or the tin can and wire. When you talk to them, how much clamoring are they, how like when you spoke to your folks, like, do they spend the first 10 minutes talking about how unfair and how much burdened their regional banks are suffering from Dodd-Frank?
No, that doesn't come up a whole lot, but I do understand why that line that this is to help the small local banks is effective there, because I actually got a scholarship through a community bank as an undergrad, and that was why I used that bank actually.
So did you support the deregulation?
That's why I'm very supportive of Heidi Heitkamp's vote.
That's right.
There we go. I mean, that is the thing, is that, like, that is theoretically, that is one reason why someone might vote for this, right? Where it's just like, well, they're holding hostage the community banks to get the other banks. And obviously that's the line you're pushing, because you were basically gestating.
I'm owned by a community bank.
You were
in North
totally
Dakota.
like birthed by one of these banks.
Two things.
Matt is not an honest broker in this instance.
That community bank is like my Foster Freeze.
There you go.
Two things, son. One, you got to do some work up there in New York to allow us to make more highly leveraged bets, because it's really hurting mom and pop store. The general store down here can't survive without that.
It's like the Manchurian Candidate.
And number two, have you met Seinfeld yet? You've been up there for a couple of years now. Did that Jew you work for take you to the diner?
This is like.
I know you shouldn't be pushy, but I think you can meet the whole gang over there. Maybe you and Lane and Jerry and everything.
The Manchurian Candidate, right? It's just like they sit you down like one of those parallax view, slideshow type of deals.
Except Matt's just like, I don't need to go through all this. I got you, fellas.
Yeah,
you
don't worry
don't
about
need
it.
to
I'm
brainwash
good.
me or nothing. I'll take care of it.